welcome everyone to another wonderful Classicopia concert, and a huge thank you to Elizabeth Borowsky for opening up this wonderful studio. It really is an intimate space, and we've been talking about doing something here and haven't had the chance yet. And it seems appropriate, the first concert we do here, to feature her younger brother and sister, Emanuel and Francis, on violin and cello. The whole family, you can read about them, have been playing concerts together since they were your age, and all over the world, Lithuania and Cuba, and they now live in Baltimore, where I live. We try to do lots of concerts together. After Elizabeth moved up here, they needed a pianist, and I was there, so it was good to be able to work together. And we have a fun program today, and hopefully one that will teach you some new composers and new music. I didn't know a lot of this music before we did it. We originally were trying to do this as part of Black History Month in February, but we had to reschedule. But it's still so important to hear about some of these black composers who have not had their due, still are trying to get heard. And if something strikes you today, I go and listen on YouTube. You can hear most of this stuff, and you'll realize just how profound, how beautiful this music is. So we're going to hear lots in the first half. The second and third pieces are all pieces based upon the spiritual tradition. Some of the most beautiful music ever composed, and this was part of that oral tradition that has now been put down, and we're so thankful. It's really the great American music. In the second half, we're going to feature some pieces that are somewhat based upon the blues, another great music of the early 20th century. But we thought we'd begin with something you might recognize, and that is Ragtime, especially The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. Ragtime has a very interesting history. It really starts off in the brothels and saloons down in the Mississippi River, and was, again, a kind of improvised art. Pianists would sort of just play in the saloon as other things were going on, and most of the time they would just be sort of improvising, making up a rag, and the next day another rag, and a lot of it was not written down. So it was up to Scott Joplin, was one of the first of the great ragtime composers, who had had some training and was able to write his music down. He was born in 1868 in Texarkana. He had a musical family. They all played instruments. But his mother was also cleaned the houses of the white people in town, and she would sometimes bring young Scott with her, and he would sit down, if the families had pianos, and begin to play the piano. And apparently he got really good, and word spread about him. And there happened to be a German immigrant in town named Julius Weise, who was a pianist, and he heard about him, and he gave lessons for free to Scott Joplin, and not only taught him how to play piano, but taught him how to write music and read music. So he really had an advantage as he decided to head out when he was 18 years old. His mother unfortunately died when he was 13. His father said at 18, it's time to get a real job, and Joplin said, I'm leaving, I'm going to try to be a musician. And so he headed up the Mississippi, traveling along in different places, listening to other ragtime performers, and he ends up in Sedalia, Missouri, and that is where the Maple Leaf Club is. And so you might have heard the Maple Leaf Rag. That has nothing to do with Canada. It's about the Maple Leaf Club there in Sedalia. And a couple years later, he would write The Entertainer, which became a big hit. And then a few years after that, the Ragtime Dance that we're going to do. Originally, the Ragtime Dance was a much larger production of about 10, 15 minutes, a choreographed dance with narration. Joplin wanted to write bigger and bigger pieces, but it was not a successful piece like that, so he redid it as a ragtime. But later in his life, Joplin really wanted to write a ragtime opera, and that's what he did, Tremonisha in 1915. Unfortunately, he could not get anybody to put this opera on. We know there was sort of one mini production that he did playing the piano by himself in Harlem, trying to get some backers to do it. It was not a success, and a year later, Joplin ended up in the Psychiatric Institute and would die penniless, impoverished. But he told people before he died, 50 years from now, they're going to be talking about me. And he was correct, but it took a while. He was about right on the time. Because after he dies, ragtime sort of slowly dies away. Ragtime was a huge thing in the early decades of the 20th century. It spread from the Mississippi to the Midwest, to New York, and all the way across the ocean. It was a huge hit in France and in England, all the way to Russia. Igor Stravinsky said ragtime was his favorite kind of music, and he wrote some ragtime pieces. But just as quickly as it spread, it sort of dies away in the early 1920s when jazz and swing start coming in. And people thought of ragtime as kind of old-fashioned. It was written down and not so much improvised. And so over the next 40 years, people just forgot about ragtime. And it was in the 1960s when a guy named Rudy Blesch wrote a book about ragtime, rediscovering some of the great ragtime composers. There was another guy who recorded some of those rags. And then in 1973, if some of you might remember, The Sting came out, a wonderful movie, which had The Entertainer as its theme song. And that really jump-started this new interest in a whole new generation loving ragtime. And in 1976, Scott Joplin's opera Tremonisha was finally put on by the Dallas Opera Company, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. So it's a real tragedy that he never saw that, but this happens to a lot of composers where they write great things that don't come out well when it's first done. I wanted to give one fun quote about how powerful this ragtime was when it first came out. This is from a German immigrant in 1903 who saw a ragtime, a piece being played. He wrote back to his wife. He said, "Suddenly I discovered that my legs were in a condition of great excitement. They twitched as though charged with electricity and betrayed a considerable and rather dangerous desire to jerk me from my seat. The rhythm of the music, which had seemed so unnatural at first, began to exert its influence over me. It wasn't that feeling of ease in the joints of the feet and the toes, which might be caused by a Strauss waltz. No, it was much more energetic, material, independent, as though one had encountered a balking horse, which was absolutely impossible to master." So the feeling of ragtime, where you have the left hand keeping a steady beat and the right hand doing the syncopation, or what we call ragging the rhythm, it really gets you sort of wanting to get up. So if you have to get up and move, I'll understand. It's part of the thing. But as I mentioned, ragtime also began to scare some of the people up north. This has happened with a lot of black music, rock and roll, rap music. As it gets into white society, there's this fear of what it is. And there's a quote from Musical America from 1909, which sort of says it all about ragtime. It says, "How can we regard this invasion of vulgarity in music other than as a national calamity? This cheap, trashy stuff could not elevate even the most degraded minds, nor could it possibly urge anyone to greater effort in the acquisition of culture in any phase. There is no element of intellectuality in the enjoyment of ragtime. It savors too much of the primeval conception of music, whose basis was a rhythm that appealed to the physical rather than to the mental senses." So dripping with racism and this fear of what that music was. But luckily ragtime has survived, and we're going to give you now The Entertainer and the ragtime dance. I forgot to mention, in the ragtime dance, there's a moment, I'm not sure, it might work. We're going to stomp the floor. There's actually a part called Stop Time, where Joplin wants us to keep the beat with our foot. It works better when we have a wood floor, but I didn't want to rip up the carpet just for this. So if you see us stomping our feet, we're not bad. We're just doing the stop time. So please put your hands together and welcome Francis and Emanuel Borowsky.